The chandeliers of Ashworth House burned with 400 candles that February evening, and the light they cast was the kind that had been engineered for cruelty. It found every jewel, every powdered shoulder, every arrangement of silk and lace that money and ambition could produce, and it made all of it look like something worth wanting. The ballroom was 3 stories of pale marble and gilded plasterwork, and every surface had been made to reflect, so that the 200 guests assembled beneath those chandeliers saw themselves multiplied back at an angle that flattered the chin and softened the jaw. It was a room that understood its purpose. It had been built to make people feel that they had arrived. And at the far edge of all that engineered radiance, seated at the writing table beside the servants' corridor entrance with a household ledger open across her knees and a pencil moving in precise, unhurried columns, was Miss Eleanor Voss. She was not watching the dancing, she was watching the footmen. 3 had been stationed at the champagne service, and 1 had not moved in 11 minutes, which meant either the supply was running low, or someone had relieved him of his post without telling Mrs. Hadfield, the housekeeper, who was currently occupied near the far door, and would not have noticed. Eleanor made a note, a small check mark beside the footman's station number, and turned a page. Her gown was gray, which was practical for evenings when she was required to be present but not visible, and her hair was pinned without ornament. She had been told on her first evening in this household 14 months ago that she should consider the color gray her particular uniform. She had not objected. Gray suited someone who intended to pay attention. The musicians played a cotillion, the floor filled with color and movement, the women arranged like flowers in a formal bed, the men like the architecture that kept them in their proper rows. Lady Cecily Marsh was among them. Ivory satin, a rope of pearls, dark hair dressed with what appeared to be fresh gardenias, and she moved through the figure with the particular confidence of a woman who has been told since the age of 7 that rooms are made for her, which, Eleanor thought, returning to her column of figures, was not inaccurate. Rooms of this kind were made for Lady Cecily Marsh. That was not a complaint. It was a structural observation. The double doors at the top of the marble stairs opened, and the room did what rooms always did when he entered. It reorganized itself, not dramatically, not with a gasp or a hush, but with the particular subtle recalibration of a scale when a new weight is placed upon it. The Duke of Carlisle had arrived, as he always arrived, precisely when his presence would be noted, without appearing to have been timed. He was tall, dark-coated, wearing no ornamentation beyond a single watch chain, and he moved through the opening acknowledgments, the bows, the murmured greetings, the practiced deference of people who wanted something from him, with the expression of a man completing a necessary obligation. Eleanor noted his arrival without looking up from her ledger. The footman at Station 3 had finally moved. She updated the column. It was not until she rose to carry a message to Mrs. Hadfield that she became aware the Duke of Carlisle had stopped moving. She crossed the edge of the floor near the musician's alcove, ledger tucked under her arm, message in hand, and looked up once to verify her path was clear, and found him watching her, not the way men occasionally watched women crossing rooms, with the particular attention of someone who has just identified something they do not yet understand, and who has decided they would like to. Eleanor did not slow her pace. She delivered the message to Mrs. Hadfield, turned, and returned to her table. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. She had been 12 years old when her father died, and the knowledge of what that meant arrived not all at once but in stages, like weather coming in from the east. First the solicitor, then her uncle, then the slow revelation of what her uncle intended to do with the estate and with her. Walter Voss was not a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He did not raise his voice. He simply proceeded as though Eleanor's father had not, in fact, left detailed instructions regarding his daughter's education, her small allowance, and her future. Or rather, he proceeded as though those instructions were suggestions, and suggestions made by a dead man did not carry the weight they once had. By the time Eleanor was 15, she was managing the household accounts for Voss Park. Not because anyone had asked her to learn them, but because no one else was managing them accurately, and it had become apparent, by the third creditor letter addressed to her uncle, that he had not opened, that someone needed to. She opened the letters herself. She organized them by urgency and amount. She produced a summary, handwritten, with columns for outstanding balance, interest accrual, and recommended response, and she placed it on her uncle's desk on a Tuesday morning in March. He had looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he had said, "This is correct," as though that were remarkable, and she had said, "Yes," and he had said, "Well, carry on," and that had been the entirety of the arrangement for the next 9 years. She carried on. What that meant in practice: the household accounts for 3 properties, the correspondence with 4 creditors, the negotiation with the wool merchant in Leeds who had been overcharging on the fleece contract since 1803, and would continue to do so unless someone read the original agreements closely enough to find the clause about weight adjustment at point of delivery, which Eleanor found in 1808, annotated in red ink, and presented to her uncle with a note explaining that they had been overpaying by approximately £42 annually, and that she had drafted a revised letter which he could sign if he chose. He signed it. She had no salary. She had board and a room and the gray dresses and the understanding, which had never been spoken aloud but was as solid as the walls, that she was fortunate to have what she had. She did not argue this point. She did not agree with it either. She simply kept her accounts and kept her pencil sharp and noted, each year, what she had done and what it had saved, in a small notebook she kept in the bottom drawer of her writing table, because it seemed important to keep evidence of the work somewhere, even if the only reader was herself. There had been one morning in the spring of her 23rd year when everything in her had wanted to stop. Not to break exactly, she was not built for breaking, but to put down the ledger and the pencil and the correspondence and simply go quiet. The creditor in York had sent a threatening letter. The wool merchant had responded to the renegotiated contract with a counteroffer designed to claw back everything she had recovered. 2 of the tenant farm leases needed renewal, and her uncle had declined to attend the meetings. And it had been 8 years since anyone had said thank you, and 11 years since anyone had said her work was good. She had sat at her writing table and pressed her hands flat against the surface, and stayed very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then she had picked up her pencil and returned to the wool merchant's counteroffer, because there was a discrepancy in his weight calculation that he was hoping she would not notice, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction. She was not going to become less than she was. That was the decision she had made at that table, though she had not articulated it in quite those words until later. She had made it in the only way she knew how, not with a declaration, but with a pencil and a page. Her uncle died in the autumn of her 26th year, which proved to be the event she had not prepared for because it was, in its way, the one that closed the arrangement entirely. His son, her cousin Philip, 22 years old and recently returned from a brief unhappy season at Oxford, inherited Voss Park and all its obligations, and he had looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has just discovered that his house comes with a piece of furniture he did not select and does not know what to do with. He had not put her out. He had, instead, arranged for her to be of use to a family of his acquaintance in London who needed someone to manage their household correspondence and accounts, the Ashworth family, as it happened, whose ballroom she now occupied on the 4th Friday of every month, counting footmen. She had been managing the Ashworth accounts for 14 months. She had recovered £612 in misbilled supplier accounts in that time, renegotiated 3 household service contracts, and identified a pattern in the kitchen purchase ledger suggesting that their previous accounts manager had been skimming approximately 30 shillings monthly for a period of at least 2 years. She had documented this, produced a summary, and given it to Lord Ashworth's solicitor without drama or embellishment. The solicitor had looked at her summary for a long time without speaking. Then he had said it was correct. She had said yes. He had said well, and she had returned to her table. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She had been told of the Duke of Carlisle's arrival at Ashworth House that evening by Mrs. Hadfield, who had mentioned it in the context of the wine inventory. 3 additional cases of the good Burgundy would need to be brought up, and the good crystal, not the everyday crystal, and Mrs. Hadfield's tone carried the particular weight of a woman who understood that the Duke of Carlisle represented something the Ashworth family very much wanted. What they wanted, precisely, was the ducal investment in Ashworth's textile interests in the north, which had been under some strain since the Manchester price collapse, and Lord Ashworth had been making careful overtures for 4 months. Eleanor knew this because she had seen the correspondence. She knew most things that passed through the household in ink. What she did not know was that the Duke of Carlisle had seen the Ashworth household accounts 3 weeks earlier. His solicitor, a Mr. Edward Fairfax, had come to the Ashworth house on a Tuesday at 11 o'clock for a preliminary review of Lord Ashworth's investment proposal, and had been shown to Lord Ashworth's study, and had been given a leather portfolio of figures, and had taken the portfolio away and returned it 4 days later with a response noting, in careful professional language, that some of the supporting documents appeared to have been prepared with unusual precision, and asking, as a matter of due diligence, whether Lord Ashworth might identify who had prepared them. Lord Ashworth had said it was his accounts manager. Mr. Fairfax had asked for a name. Lord Ashworth had looked briefly uncertain and had said, "Miss Voss, I believe," and Fairfax had written this down. The Duke had received this note on a Friday evening and had read it twice. He had then gone to his study, found the portfolio, and examined the supporting accounts again, not for the figures, which he had already verified, but for the methodology. The accounts had been organized by a system he had not encountered in any previous investment review. Each discrepancy was documented with its source, its correction, and a notation indicating when the correction had been made and what it had prevented. Not merely the numbers, but the reasoning behind them. Not merely the work, but the evidence that the work had been done carefully and with long judgment. He had set the portfolio down on his desk and sat with it for a while. He had been running his estate since his mother died, 16 years ago, when he was 19, and had inherited a dukedom whose accounts were in a condition that had required 3 years to properly repair. He had repaired them himself, in the end, because the solicitors he had engaged had proved adequate but not precise. He knew what precision looked like from the inside. He knew what it cost. He had sent Fairfax a note the following morning. "Find out what you can about a Miss Eleanor Voss, accounts manager to the Ashworth household." The report had arrived a week later. It was brief. She had not done much that was publicly visible, which was, Fairfax noted, rather the point. What it contained was this: 9 years managing the Voss Park accounts under a guardian who had never credited her name to anything, a documented recovery of £42 annually from a wool merchant contract, through a clause identification that the merchant's own solicitor had not caught. £612 recovered in her first 14 months with the Ashworth household, a previous accounts manager's fraud identified and documented with evidence sufficient for legal action, which the Ashworths had declined to pursue, and no salary on record in any household she had served. The report concluded with Mr. Fairfax's observation, offered in dry professional language, that Miss Voss appeared to be operating at the level of a senior estate manager while being compensated and credited at the level of a household servant, and that this was not unusual, but it was notable. The Duke had read this report 3 times. He had then done something private and deliberate. He had attended the Ashworth dinner that Tuesday, which he had previously declined, and he had, in the process of arriving early to speak with Lord Ashworth's steward about a matter of no particular significance, found himself passing through the east corridor adjacent to the morning room, and heard, through the closed door, the sound of a pen moving steadily across paper, not the small occasional scratching of someone writing a letter, the sustained rhythmic movement of someone working through a long document. He had stopped. He had stood in the corridor for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he had continued to the steward's office, had completed his business, and had departed. He had attended the Thursday gathering as well, and the small musical evening on the following Monday. At neither of these had he done more than observe that Miss Voss was present in whatever background capacity the Ashworths required, and that she moved through these spaces with the particular economy of a person who has learned to take up exactly as much room as she needs, and not 1 inch more. He had not spoken to her. He had not been introduced. He had stood at the Friday ball and watched her cross the edge of the dance floor with a household ledger under her arm and a message in hand, moving with the quiet directness of someone who has been managing crises before breakfast for years. And he had understood, with the clarity of a stone dropped into still water, that he had been looking for precisely this quality for a very long time, and had not known where to find it. He had not approached her that evening. The moment had not been the right one. What he did instead was request, through Lord Ashworth, a formal meeting with the household accounts manager at 10 o'clock the following Wednesday morning, on the grounds that he wished to review the supporting documentation for the investment proposal before proceeding further. Eleanor received this request from Lord Ashworth on Tuesday afternoon. He delivered it in the way he delivered most things that inconvenienced him slightly, with the expression of a man who has just been handed something heavy and has not decided where to put it. He said the Duke wanted to go over the accounts. He said Eleanor should prepare the relevant documents. He said she should be prepared to answer questions. He did not say he was grateful for the accounts or that they had impressed anyone or that she had done well. He said be ready at 10. Eleanor said she would be ready at 10 and returned to her work. She spent Tuesday evening preparing a summary document that she had not been asked to prepare, a 3-page annotated overview of the investment relevant accounts, organized by date, cross-referenced with the original supplier agreements and the recovery documentation, with a final page noting current standing, projected recovery, and 2 areas where the methodology could be improved if the right information were available. She worked by candlelight until 11:30. She had managed far more complex problems by candlelight. She could manage this. The Wednesday morning meeting was held in Lord Ashworth's study, which was a room that had not been designed for working. It had been designed for the appearance of working, which meant leather chairs and a large desk with very little on it, and a portrait of the first Lord Ashworth in the posture of a man who has not needed to look at a figure in 40 years. Eleanor arrived at 5 minutes to 10 and arranged her documents on the reading table near the window. Lord Ashworth arrived at 2 minutes past 10. The Duke of Carlisle arrived at precisely 10, which meant he entered the room and found Eleanor already positioned at the table with her papers in order and her pencil in hand, and the small, precise shock of this was visible, briefly, before he composed it into the expression of professional interest that he wore for meetings. He was taller than she had registered from across the ballroom floor. He moved with the kind of physical economy that large men sometimes achieved, no gesture wasted, no adjustment performed for effect. He bowed, which was more than was strictly required, and Lord Ashworth made the introduction and then found a reason to excuse himself within 4 minutes, which Eleanor had anticipated. Miss Voss, the Duke said, and took the chair on the opposite side of the reading table, not the large chair behind the desk, the working chair directly across from her. I understand you prepared the supporting accounts for the investment proposal. I did, Your Grace. I found them useful, more than useful, They answered several questions I would otherwise have needed to ask separately. He paused. I have some additional questions. She presented the summary document. He looked at it for a long moment before responding, the same quality of attention she had noticed at the ball, which was not the attention of someone waiting to speak, but of someone actually reading. He asked about the wool merchant clause on the second page. She explained it. He asked whether she had applied the same methodology to the tenant farm leases at Voss Park. She said she had, though without the benefit of a legal review in the final year because her uncle had not engaged one, and she had identified 2 clauses that she believed needed reconsideration but had been unable to test. He asked what the clauses were. She told him. He picked up his own pencil. He had brought one, which she found notable, and wrote something in the margin of his own copy. She watched him do this without expression. The third area you've identified, he said, turning to the final page, where you note that the methodology could be improved with additional information. What information would you need? She had not expected him to find that page first. She told him what she would need. Access to the original long-term lease agreements, 3 years of supplier invoices rather than 2, and someone with authority to pursue the outstanding recovery from the previous accounts manager, which currently stood at an estimated £68 and could not be acted upon without Lord Ashworth's direction. He made a note. The £68. Is that figure documented? It is, Your Grace. I can provide the documentation. He looked at her with the particular stillness of a man who has just had a thing confirmed that he was already fairly certain of. How long have you been working at this level? He said, without anyone asking you what you need. The question was so precise and so entirely unexpected that Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She did not answer it directly, because it was not quite the kind of question that had a direct answer in a professional meeting in Lord Ashworth's study. She said instead, I have what I require to do the work, Your Grace. He nodded, and she could not determine whether he had accepted this or simply declined to press it. He rose at 11, collected his papers, and bowed again. At the door he turned back. Miss Voss, the Carlisle estate accounts have not been properly reviewed since my estate manager retired 2 years ago. I have engaged temporary clerks, but the work has not been done at this standard. I will speak with Lord Ashworth. She did not allow herself to decide what that meant until after the door had closed. It meant, as she learned 3 days later when Lord Ashworth informed her with the expression of a man giving up a household appliance he had grown accustomed to, that the Duke of Carlisle was offering her a formal position as estate accounts manager at Carlisle House in Mayfair, at a salary of £90 annually, with full access to the estate ledgers, the supplier agreements, and the legal correspondence. The salary was, by Eleanor's calculation, approximately £90 more annually than she was currently receiving. Lord Ashworth said the Duke had been very clear that he expected her to accept, and that he, Lord Ashworth, had agreed it was an appropriate arrangement. Eleanor said she would consider it, and give her answer by Thursday. Lord Ashworth looked as though this were an unusual response. Eleanor returned to her table. She considered it carefully, the way she considered everything, not from the position of wanting, which was a direction she had learned to be cautious about, but from the position of what was real. What was real, it was the kind of work she was already doing, with resources she did not currently have. What was also real, the Duke of Carlisle was a man whose measured attention she did not yet understand, and she had learned not to build on foundations she hadn't inspected. What was finally real, she had been managing other people's money in rooms that did not see her for 14 years. £90 and a proper title to the work did not seem like a thing to refuse out of caution. She gave her answer Thursday morning. It was yes. She arrived at Carlisle House on a Monday in late March at 8 o'clock in the morning, with a trunk containing her gray dresses, her notebooks, and the small annotated ledger of 9 years' work that she had kept in the bottom drawer, and had never shown to anyone. The housekeeper who met her at the side entrance was a Mrs. Lawrence, a broad, direct woman of perhaps 55, who looked at Eleanor's trunk, her notebooks, and her pencil case and said, "Right then. The estate ledgers are in a state. The study fire's already lit. I'll have coffee sent up at past. Eleanor had not expected the coffee. "Thank you, Mrs. Lawrence." "The Duke's away until Wednesday," Mrs. Lawrence said. "You'll have 2 days without him in the way. Use them." And she led Eleanor down the corridor to the estate study, which was a working room, genuinely a working room, with actual papers on the actual desk and 4 years of ledgers stacked in an order that suggested urgency rather than organization, and left her to it. By Wednesday morning, Eleanor had organized the ledgers into 3 categories: accurate, inaccurate, and uncertain. The accurate stack was the shortest. The uncertain stack was the tallest. She had identified a pattern of supplier billing discrepancies across 7 vendors that had been accumulating since the previous estate manager's retirement, totaling, by her current estimate, which required 2 more days to confirm, somewhere between £200 and £400 in unrecovered overcharges. She had drafted a preliminary summary on 6 pages, cross-referenced with the original supplier agreements from 1819 and 1820. She had also found at the bottom of the uncertain stack a set of tenant farm accounts from the previous decade that had been incorrectly consolidated in a way that obscured approximately £30 annually in owed adjustments. She set those aside for separate consideration. There was a housekeeper, a maid named Betsy, who brought Eleanor's meals to the study without being asked, and who had taken to leaving a small plate of biscuits alongside the coffee with the air of someone performing a private act of solidarity. And there was a stable master, Mr. Graves, who had caught her in the corridor on the first morning and told her, without particular warmth but with obvious intention, that she should let him know if she needed the estate maps because the previous accounts manager had had them and never returned them, and he believed they were in the 3rd cabinet from the left in the archive room. They were. Eleanor thanked him. He said nothing further and returned to his stable. The Duke arrived Wednesday afternoon. He came to the estate study directly from the hall. She heard his voice in the corridor, a brief word to the footman, and knocked once before entering, which she found notable because it was his house, and he had not needed to knock. "Miss Voss," he said, "how does it stand?" She showed him the summary. He read it standing, which she had not anticipated, but she did not offer him a chair because he had not sat. He turned to page 3, which contained the supplier discrepancy figures. He read it twice. £400, he said, not as a question. 200 at confirmed minimum, 400 at probable maximum, pending the last 2 vendor accounts. I should have a confirmed figure by Friday. He set the summary down on the desk and looked at her with the same measuring attention she had noticed at the Ashworth ball, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he found worth looking at. It was not a comfortable kind of attention. It was not uncomfortable either. It was the specific attentiveness of someone who was actually paying attention, which was different from anything she had encountered before, and felt, therefore, slightly like a note played in the wrong key. Not wrong exactly, but unfamiliar enough to require adjustment. "I'll expect the confirmed figure Friday," he said. "Is there anything you need?" "The legal correspondence with the wool vendor from 1819. I believe there's a weight adjustment clause that may have been misapplied, and I'd like to verify before I put it in the summary." He went to the 2nd cabinet on the left, not the 3rd, the 2nd, and found the folder without looking for it. He had known where it was. He set it on her desk. "Thank you, Your Grace." He paused at the door. "The archive room key is on the hook beside the window. You should have it with you." She looked at the hook. The key was there. She had not known it was there. "Thank you," she said again. He nodded and left, and Eleanor pressed one hand briefly against the surface of the desk before returning to the wool vendor correspondence. The weeks that followed had a shape she had not anticipated. The work was straightforward. It was simply more of the same kind of work she had been doing for 14 years, with better resources and actual authority to act on what she found. She confirmed the supplier discrepancy figure at £342 and presented it to the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Fairfax, who received it with the expression of a man who had expected something less precise and was visibly recalibrating. She drafted revised agreements with 4 of the 7 vendors and sent them under the Duke's name with his authorization, which he had given. After reviewing each one with the same reading attention he applied to everything. She found the tenant farm adjustment and documented it. She opened the 1820 accounts, which no one had fully examined since the previous manager had filed them, and found a set of entries that suggested a billing agreement with a northern timber supplier had been running on a rate that had legally expired in 1818, which meant the estate had been paying an above-market rate for 2 years past its obligation. She brought this to the Duke in the library one evening at 7:30, because she had found it at 6:30 and it had not seemed the kind of thing to sit on until morning. He was there when she arrived, a lamp lit, a book face down on the arm of his chair, and he looked up when she knocked and said to come in, and she presented the documentation without preamble. He read it at his chair and did not speak for a moment. "How certain are you?" he asked. "I've checked it against the original agreement, the renewal correspondence from 1817, and the payment ledger. The legal rate expired in February 1818. The estate has been paying the old rate for 26 months. What would we have owed under the correct rate?" she told him. He sat back in his chair and studied the ceiling briefly. "What's your recommendation?" She told him that too. He said he would instruct Fairfax in the morning. He rose, which brought him to his full height, and she was again aware that the room was not large, and that he occupied a considerable portion of it. "Miss Voss, the work you've done in 6 weeks, do you have any sense of what 3 years of adequate but not precise management cost this estate? By my current estimate, somewhere between £1,100 and £1,500 in unrecovered or incorrectly paid accounts. I'll have a closer figure in another 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a criticism of you," he said. "I engaged the wrong people." It was not the first time she had heard a version of this from him, the specific, contained way he had of acknowledging a thing without performing it. It was, she thought, what distinguished him most from the other men of his position she had encountered. He said the true thing and left it standing. "Your mother," Eleanor said, which she had not planned to say, and which stopped the room for a brief moment. She continued, because there was no recovering a sentence without finishing it. "The accounts show a set of household expenditures from 1809 through 1811 that are organized quite differently from the years around them. More carefully, more specifically. I thought it might be relevant to mention." The Duke was very still, not rigid, simply still, in the way of a man absorbing something carefully. "She kept them herself," he said, "in the last 2 years of her life." Eleanor nodded. "The system she used is a good one. I've borrowed several elements of it." He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was the same as it had been before, measured, contained, but there was something beneath it that was quieter and heavier than either. "I didn't know anyone had seen those. I should have mentioned it sooner. I apologize for the delay." He shook his head slowly, and there was a quality to the silence that was not uncomfortable but was full in the way of something with weight. He picked up his book, which was not a dismissal but was the particular action of a man who needs a moment to find his footing. She gathered her papers. At the door she turned back, because she had been going to say something practical and useful, and instead found herself noticing that his cravat was crooked. Had been crooked, she realized, for the entire conversation. The left side tucked unevenly so that it pulled the knot off-center by approximately an inch. She had noticed it 40 minutes ago, and had said nothing because it had not been relevant. "Your cravat has been crooked for 40 minutes, she said. "I thought you should know." He looked at her. She could not tell precisely what the expression was, something between startled and something else she did not have a clean name for. "Thank you," he said. She left him to the library. She pressed her hand against the wall in the corridor outside briefly before continuing toward the stairs. The difficulty arrived in April, as difficulties tended to, not with a warning but simply with a presence, the way weather comes in when you haven't checked the horizon. Lady Cecily Marsh had been in Lord Ashworth's ballroom in February for the same reason she had been at every gathering of consequence in that season, because she was understood, in the overlapping social circles that constituted the world these people lived in, to be the appropriate match for the Duke of Carlisle. This was not gossip or speculation. It was the considered view of Lord Hadley, the Duke's father's oldest friend, and the man who had managed the Carlisle family's social interests since the old Duke's death 7 years ago. Lord Hadley had spent 3 seasons arranging occasions for the Duke and Lady Cecily to inhabit the same rooms, and he had done this with the deliberate patience of a man who believed that proximity was the only tool required when 2 appropriate people were involved. He arrived at Carlisle House on the 2nd Thursday in April, at noon, and was shown to the drawing room, and the Duke received him there. Eleanor was in the estate study, which shared a wall with the drawing room, and she was not listening, but she was not entirely unable to hear, and the conversation that came through the wall, indistinct but audible in tone if not in word, had the shape of a man making a case that he had made before, and a man declining to confirm it. She returned to the timber supplier correspondence and did not consider what she had heard. What she could not avoid was the dinner Lord Hadley gave the following Tuesday, to which the Duke of Carlisle was expected, and to which, through a chain of social logic that Eleanor did not trace but felt the outcome of, she was also present, in the background role that her position at Carlisle House had begun to make slightly ambiguous, because she was no longer quite a household employee in the way she had been at Ashworth, and was not quite a guest in the way the other women present were. Lady Cecily Marsh was there. She was pleasant to Eleanor in the way that people are pleasant to things that do not require their attention, not unkindly, not with malice, but with the comprehensive unnoticing of someone who has genuinely not registered that there is anything in the room to notice. Eleanor understood this. She had spent 14 years being unnoticed. She knew its texture. It was Lady Cecily's companion, a Miss Fentworth, who provided the confrontation, not from malice either, but from the specific carelessness of someone who assumes that a thing said in one key of voice will not carry across a room that is arranged against it. She said to Lady Cecily, in what she believed was a quiet voice, that it was rather surprising Lord Hadley had included the accounts woman, and that she supposed the Duke had some sentimental notion about useful employees. The room did not pause. No one else, to Eleanor's observation, had heard it. Eleanor had heard it. She set down her sherry glass and turned to face the room with the expression she kept for this precise circumstance. Not blank, not cold, but exact. The expression of a woman who has been doing the actual work for long enough that she knows precisely where she stands and does not require anyone else's accounting to verify it. She did not address Miss Fentworth. She did not raise her voice. She turned to the elder gentleman on her left, a Mr. Harwood, who was Lord Hadley's retired solicitor, and had been speaking to her about the property consolidation laws of 1815, and she said, "You were saying, Mr. Harwood, that the consolidation clause had a 3-year review provision that most estates missed?" Mr. Harwood said yes, that was precisely it. And had she encountered it in her own work? She had. She told him about the Voss Park lease renewals and the clause she had identified in 1814, which had saved the estate approximately £38 in unnecessary renewal fees and which had, as far as she knew, never been attributed to anyone in particular. Mr. Harwood listened with the expression of someone who is genuinely engaged, and by the time the conversation concluded, she had been approached by two other guests who had overheard, and the evening had continued, and Miss Fentworth had said nothing further. She had picked up her list and continued. The Duke had not been present for the exchange, but at the end of the evening, when the guests were gathering their things in the hall, he found his way to her side and said, in a voice calibrated for her alone, "How was the dinner?" "Useful," Eleanor said. "Mr. Harwood knows a great deal about the 1815 consolidation laws." "He wrote several of them," the Duke said. Eleanor looked at him. "You seated me beside him deliberately. I asked Lord Hadley to." He paused. "I thought you might find it worthwhile." She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like attention, but this was something she could verify, an action, a real one, with a real effect that she had experienced, and the particular quality of it, which was practical and considered and entirely without performance, was the kind of thing she found it difficult to place in any existing category she had for the behavior of men of his position. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and meant it in two directions at once. The trouble with Lord Hadley came to a point in the third week of April. He called on the Duke again, and this time he brought a letter from the old Duke's solicitor, which was a different solicitor from the current one, which was the kind of distinction that mattered enormously in these matters, outlining the terms of an informal understanding that had existed between the Carlyle family and the Marsh family since approximately 1814. The letter did not constitute a legal obligation, but it was the kind of letter that was intended to constitute a social one, and Lord Hadley placed it on the Duke's desk with the expression of a man who believes he is delivering clarity. Eleanor was not present for this meeting. She learned about it because the Duke told her, that same evening, in the estate study, in the direct, unceremonious way he had of saying the thing that was actual. He stood in the doorway and said, "Lord Hadley has revived the question of Lady Cecily Marsh. I want you to know about it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked. "Because it will become relevant to your situation here, and I do not intend for you to learn it from someone else." He paused. "And because I intend to make a different arrangement, if you are willing." The room was very still, not the artificial stillness of a held breath, but the particular settled stillness of a thing that has been working toward a point and has arrived at it. "That is a significant statement," Eleanor said. "Yes, I would like to consider it." "I expected you to." He looked at her with that same quality of attention, measuring, genuine, unhurried. "There is no urgency. I simply wanted you to know where I stand." She nodded. He withdrew. She sat at her desk for a long time with her hands flat on the surface and did not reach for her pencil. The reckoning came at the end of April, at a gathering of the Northern Textile Investment Council. 11 men, 3 of them titled, all of them holding interests in the Carlyle Estates' proposed investment arrangement with Lord Ashworth's partners, at a private meeting room in a building near the Strand. Eleanor had been asked to attend as the preparer of the accounts documentation. Lord Hadley had not expected her to speak. Lord Ashworth, who was also present, had not expected her to speak. The council's chairman, a Sir Gideon Trevelyan, had looked at her when she entered, and then looked at the Duke with the expression of a man reconsidering the arrangements. The meeting had been called because 3 members of the council had raised questions about the Ashworth accounts, specifically about whether the recovery figures Eleanor had documented represented genuine improvements or had been constructed to obscure ongoing problems. This was the institutional opposition in its plainest form. Not personal animus, but structural skepticism, the kind that had a face but no name, and was as impersonal and as immovable as stone. It was not saying she had falsified anything. It was simply refusing to accept that a woman who had been an accounts manager for a household had done work at the level she appeared to have done. She had brought everything, not a summary, not an overview. The original accounts, the supplier agreements, the billing correspondence, the annotated ledgers, the recovery documentation, the revised contracts, the timber supplier legal analysis, the 6-page preliminary summary, and the follow-up with Fairfax's notation that the confirmed figure matched her preliminary estimate within £11. She had organized them in chronological order, cross-referenced by subject, and she had prepared a 1-page index at the front that told anyone who picked up the packet exactly where to find any document they might need. She set this on the council table at 10 o'clock and stood beside it. Sir Gideon Trevelyan looked at the packet. He looked at her. "Miss Voss," he said, with the particular cadence of a man who is about to ask a question he expects to be unanswered. "These figures, the supplier discrepancy recovery, specifically, you say £342. "Yes, sir. Recovered across 7 vendor accounts, documented individually beginning at page 43. The original billing rates are at page 44, the corrected rates at page 45, and the revised contracts are at pages 46 through 61. Each contract carries the vendor's signature and the date of correction." He turned to page 43. The room watched him. "The timber supplier account," said another council member, a Mr. Claridge, who had not looked at her when she entered, and was not looking at her now. "The claim that the estate was paying an above-market rate past the legal expiration of the agreement. What is that based on?" "The original supplier agreement, at page 72, which specifies a rate valid through February 1818. The renewal correspondence at page 73, which carries the Duke's late father's solicitor's signature and contains the renewed rate, which was intended to be at the adjusted market rate, but was never formally documented. The payment ledger at page 74, which shows the estate continuing to pay the 1817 rate through April 1820. The market rate records at page 75, which show what the correct rate should have been from February 1818 onward. The difference is 9 shillings per load, across 206 loads over 26 months. The total overcharge is £103. Mr. Claridge had turned to page 72. He was reading. The room was quiet, with the particular quality of a room that is not expected to have to look carefully, and is finding that it must. "Miss Voss," said a third member, whose name she did not know, from the far end of the table, "the accounts management you conducted at the Ashworth household, you were engaged there for 14 months. The previous accounts manager had been there for 6 years. You're saying he was skimming?" "I am saying the documentation at pages 91 through 97 shows a pattern of small irregular charges across the kitchen purchase ledger between January 1818 and February 1820, totaling approximately 32 shillings monthly. The pattern is consistent with systematic billing irregularity. I made no legal determination. I documented what the ledger showed and gave it to Lord Ashworth's solicitor, who verified it. Yes. How long did it take you to find it?" 3 weeks. The man at the far end of the table looked at Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth looked at his hands. Sir Gideon Trevelyan set down the packet and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who is making a recalibration that he would prefer not to have to make, but who is honest enough with himself to make it. "The index at the front," he said. "You prepared this?" "Yes, sir." "It took you how long?" 4 hours. He nodded once. He looked at the Duke, who had been seated at the head of the table for the entire proceedings and had not spoken, and who had been watching Eleanor with the same quality of attention he had been carrying since February, measuring and certain and entirely public. The room understood it before it could articulate it. Sir Gideon said, "I have no further questions about the documentation." "Nor I," said Mr. Claridge, who had been on page 74 and was only now looking up. The room did not erupt. There was a long suspended moment in which 11 men and a Duke and Lord Hadley, who was seated near the door, processed what had just happened in their separate ways. Then the Duke of Carlisle rose from his chair, and the room recalibrated again. He did not make a speech. He said, "Miss Voss prepared these accounts. She identified every discrepancy in this documentation, recovered the figures, negotiated the revised contracts, and prepared the evidence you have just reviewed. I am asking the council to recognize her work on record." He paused. "I am also asking her, before this room, whether she has reconsidered the question I put to her 3 weeks ago." Eleanor looked at him. 311 people had told her, across 14 years, in various ways and at various volumes, that she was the kind of woman who did the work that other people stood up and presented. She had a ledger in her trunk at home in which she had documented every year of that work, in precise columns, for the only reader who had ever seen it, which was herself. "I have considered it," she said. "Yes." The room had changed. Lord Hadley was very still near the door. Lady Cecily Marsh was not present. She had not been expected in this room, which was not her room, but she would hear about it, as everyone eventually heard about things that happened in rooms like this. And it would matter to her, Eleanor knew, for a time, and then it would cease to matter, because Lady Cecily Marsh would find another room built for her, and she would be correct to do so. The system was intact, only this small portion of it had shifted. The Duke crossed the room to her and offered his hand. She took it, and he held it for a moment, a bare hand, properly, because her gloves were in her pocket from the work, and then brought it briefly to his lips in front of 11 men, a council chairman, and Lord Hadley. Lord Hadley, to his credit, said nothing. He was a man of principle within his limitations, and his limitation was that he had looked at Eleanor and seen category rather than individual. He would not have said this was unfair. He simply would have said it was how things were ordered. He looked at her now, not with conversion, not with warmth, but with the specific expression of a man who has seen something he expected to be one thing and has discovered it to be another, and who is honest enough to admit, privately, that the difference was larger than he had calculated. He caught her alone in the corridor afterward, as the council was dispersing. He said, "Miss Voss, I oppose this arrangement." He stopped. "I may have been looking at the wrong document. It was not an apology. It was a recalibration, delivered without warmth but without contempt. And it was more, she knew, than she would have received from most men in his position." She inclined her head. "I appreciate you saying so, Lord Hadley." He nodded, once, and left. The private proposal came that evening, in the estate study, which had become, over 6 weeks, the room most entirely her own in a house she had not yet learned to consider hers. The fire was lit and the lamp was on, and she was reviewing the final timber supplier documentation, not because it required reviewing again, but because her hands needed occupation. The Duke knocked and entered and stood for a moment looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was not composed and not contained but simply open, the way a door is open, without performance and without uncertainty about whether it should be. "I want to say it properly," he said, "now that there are no witnesses to require it of me." He paused. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted to the requirements my position imposes, but because I have not encountered, in 16 years of running an estate and attempting to find people precise enough to be trusted with what it actually requires, a mind that works the way yours works. And because I have been standing in corridors listening for 3 months, and I would very much rather stop standing in corridors." Eleanor set her papers down. She looked at him fully, which was not something she did casually. "I have £90 annually," she said. "You have more than that now. I have 14 years of accounts in a notebook in my trunk that no one has ever looked at." "I've looked at them," he said. "I asked Fairfax. He said you kept records. I wanted to know what was in them." She was quiet for a moment. She had kept those records for the only reader she had, and the only reader she had been for 14 years was herself. She had never expected the reader to change. "That was a private document," she said. "Yes, I'm sorry for it, but I needed to know what I was asking." It was not the right thing. It was also, she recognized, the true thing. The act of a man who had done his research before arriving, who had looked at what she had built when no one was watching, and had decided, on that basis, to ask. It was the specific kind of respect she had not encountered before, the kind that looked at the work. "Yes," she said, to the question, "for what it's worth." He crossed the room, which was not many steps, and took her hand in both of his. He did not say anything further. He did not need to. He simply held it and looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since February, as something worth the attention, and she let herself be looked at, for the first time in a very long time, without adjusting for the angle. They were married in June, in a ceremony that was small by the standards of a ducal wedding, and large by the standards of anything Eleanor had attended as a participant, rather than a background figure. Betsy wept at the service, which was warm and specific of her. Mrs. Lawrence presented Eleanor with a copy of the household accounts, newly organized in a system that had borrowed considerably from Eleanor's own methodology, which was the most direct expression of welcome the housekeeper appeared to know how to give. Mr. Graves sent a note through Mrs. Lawrence's hand. The estate maps were in order. Eleanor wrote him a thank you that was 3 sentences long. He kept it, she later learned, in his coat pocket. The estates required another 8 months of organized attention before the accounts were running as she intended, and she gave them that attention with the same methodical precision she had brought to everything, with the additional resource, now, of a solicitor who returned her correspondence promptly, and a duke who could act on her recommendations the same day she made them. The £342 in recovered charges was the beginning. By December she had identified and acted on every discrepancy she had logged, and the estate was running at a margin she had projected in her preliminary summary in March, and which Mr. Fairfax said he had believed was optimistic, and which she had said was not. She drew up, in the winter of that year, a set of annotated account management principles organized from her 14 years of practice, 12 pages, with specific examples from the Voss Park leases, the Ashworth recovery, and the Carlisle supplier accounts, and gave a copy to Mr. Fairfax, and asked if he thought it might be useful to share with other estate managers in his practice. He said he thought it would be. He shared it with 9 estate managers in his practice, and 4 others he corresponded with. 3 of them wrote back. 2 of them implemented the methodology. One of them wrote a second letter asking if Miss Voss, the Duchess of Carlisle he should say, might be willing to correspond further. She was willing. She kept that correspondence in a separate file, which grew. Their daughter Clara arrived in the spring of the 2nd year, small, dark-haired, with the Duke's particular quality of looking at things very carefully before deciding what to make of them, and Eleanor's habit of organizing whatever came to hand into some kind of useful order. By the time she could walk, Clara had twice rearranged the books on the lower study shelves by a system that was impenetrable to everyone except Eleanor, who looked at it one morning and recognized the logic immediately, and felt something that was not pride exactly, but was close to it, in the way that a well-built bridge is close to beautiful, sound and purposeful and made to hold. It was an ordinary evening in the autumn of Clara's 2nd year, when Eleanor looked up from her desk and found the Duke in the doorway, watching her, not with the measuring attention of that first evening in the Ashworth ballroom, though that quality was still there, settled now into something more permanent and more comfortable. The attention of a man who has been watching the same person work for 3 years and has found it, each time, worth watching. Clara was asleep above them. The fire was lit. The estate accounts were in order. The lamp cast a precise circle of light over the document Eleanor was drafting, the 3rd revision of her account management principles, which had grown to 22 pages, and which she had been asked to present to the Society for Estate Management in the spring, which was a thing that had not been possible until recently, and was possible now. She had known he was in the doorway for several minutes. She straightened her spine, set down her pencil, and looked at him. "The fire needs another log," she said. He crossed the room, without haste, and put another log on the fire. Then he came to stand beside her desk and looked down at the 22 pages and picked up the first page with the careful attention he gave to everything she had written. She let him read. The room was warm and quiet and complete. She had brought everything she had. She had put it to work. And this, the lamp, the fire, the man reading her work as though it were worth reading, this was what the work had built.